Great. Well, thanks everyone for being here. I am excited to be with you all today. My name is Grace Relf, as Lisa said. I am with Berkeley Lab on the Energy Markets and Planning team here, and previously was at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, where I had the pleasure of working with some really exceptional energy innovators. So it's really nice to meet you all. I hope that today you'll come away with a greater understanding of the power system as a whole, electricity regulation, and why electricity regulation is important. This is a relatively smaller group, so I'd be happy if you all would chime in with your questions or put them in the chat. If I don't see them in the chat, please feel free to raise your hand or just come off mute and ask your question. So during the presentation, I'm going to go over some basics of the power sector, and then we'll cover why utilities are regulated and what regulators do. We're going to talk through the different types of electricity markets and players in those markets. And then we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of different types of proceedings and what regulators do. There is a lot of information on these slides, so I hope that you'll find them to be a good resource going forward and that you can come back and reference them later. Okay, so to get into today, I wanted to kind of understand who was in the audience. So I'm going to start a poll and see who we got here today. Okay, so what kind of organization are you with? PUC, State Energy Office, other state agency, utility, tribe. Cool. Okay, almost everybody responded quite quickly. We've got a nice mix of PUCs, state energy offices, utilities, tribes. That's great. If you want to put what state you're in the chat, that'd be great too. Just interested to learn more about where you all are coming from and what you're interested in. Okay, let's see. I'm going to share the results just quickly so you all can see. But again, we've got a nice mix here. Okay, great. All right. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with some power sector fundamentals here. At a very foundational level, electricity supply and demand have to be in balance for the grid to remain stable and for it to maintain its frequency. That's a technical term for the number of oscillations in the electrical current. In order to keep everything in sync, grid operators can deploy what they call, or we call, ancillary services. For example, operators typically have reserves or backup generation ready to go in case a power plant goes offline unexpectedly. Ancillary services also include frequency and voltage support, black start capabilities, which refers to when a power plant can restart on its own without any support from the grid. That's like in case there's a big grid outage. Each type of generation and resource has different characteristics that impacts how it provides electricity to the grid and what kind of grid services it provides. So for example, solar energy only produces energy when it's sunny. Wind can be even more variable, and other power plants might produce energy more consistently throughout the day, or they might be used just during times of peak demand. Demand side resources like energy efficiency and demand flexibility provide critical load reducing and shifting services. And beyond just when energy is being produced, generators have different characteristics for what ancillary services they provide. So for example, some units might not be capable of starting up quickly enough to act as operating reserves or those really responsive needs, while others might actually be dedicated to responding to frequency changes that require responses in less than a second. Historically, grid operators have had a few really large generators to balance on the grid, but now there are many more variable resources, customer-sited generators, and balancing the grid is more complicated than it has been. So it's requiring a lot of innovation, new technology, and yeah, grid operators are actually having to gain experience with these new types of resources as well. This diagram is a high-level overview of the grid, and we're going to start here on the left section labeled generation. It's on the left, but also now we have distributed energy resources on the far right. There are many types of generators. Some are thermal units or power plants that use heat to produce energy, like those that run on coal or natural gas or nuclear fuel. And then others run on renewable fuels like solar or wind. You might also hear the terms baseload or peaking units, which refers to how the power plant is used. Baseload meaning that it serves load consistently throughout the day, and peaking meaning that it serves load at times of high demand. Customers are also becoming a much more meaningful part of the generation mix by installing those grid edge resources, GERs, or distributed energy resources, DERs. Those are things like rooftop solar batteries. Even some electric vehicles have the potential to send electricity back to the grid. In Hawaii, we actually, a huge portion of our generation comes from rooftop solar. It's between 15 and 20% of all of our generation across these islands, which is pretty significant. So once the power is generated, if it's not being consumed right there, it has to be transmitted to where it will be used. So the transmission system operates at higher voltages to be able to move power efficiently across long distances. Transmission is a really hot topic in the industry at the moment, so I wanted to be sure to touch on just why it's so critical. So first, cities make up a big portion of electricity demand, but there's often not enough physical space to be able to host big energy units or power plants. So open spaces are really good for building power plants, but then you have to get that electricity to where it's actually going to be consumed. And then, as we'll talk about, electricity demand is growing quite quickly. So we have to build new power plants to help meet that growing demand and need transmission to get it to where it's consumed. One challenge is that it's actually very complicated to build transmission. One, it's very capital intensive, it's expensive. It often crosses multiple states, and allocating those costs, like who's going to pay for what, can be very challenging. So for that reason, we have a national regulator, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and players in the transmission space are continuously working to help improve how we build transmission and get it online more quickly. So next in this diagram, we have the medium or low voltage distribution system that gets electricity from the transmission system to your house and to other buildings or places where it will be consumed. So in order to do this, first, the electricity has to be stepped down in voltage by transformers at the substation level. Then a feeder or a circuit takes the electricity out of the substation at what we call the primary distribution level before it is stepped down in voltage again to the secondary distribution level for delivery to where it gets consumed. In addition to the physical equipment, the distribution system also includes advanced technology that helps with monitoring the grid, how it's operating, keeping everything secure, and helping to operate things as we go. I am a huge electricity infrastructure nerd, and I think it's fun to understand kind of what I'm seeing around me in the world. So on the left here is a picture of a utility pole. It's a kind of a typical pole setup. At the top, those are the higher voltage primary distribution wires. And those little discs that you see on the on your poles are insulators, and they make sure that those lines don't touch and insulate that. Fuses then help interrupt power flow in a circuit if needed, and transformers step the voltage down for delivery through the secondary wires on the bottom. Those really thick black lines that you see on the bottom of poles are typically telecommunications equipment. At the substation, there's a lot of different equipment that helps to maintain electricity stability as the power goes from the transmission to the distribution system. So that's things like buswork that interconnects equipment, circuit breakers that can interrupt power flow if there's a problem, voltage regulators and capacitors, both of which help maintain appropriate voltages, and then transformers to change the voltage. Because we have to match supply to demand, customers are a huge component of the electrical system. These images just give you a sense of how our electricity is actually being used at the end use customer. Over time, our electricity sales have grown dramatically, but in the last few decades, growth has been slower, and now it's going up again. And in the residential sector, much of that electricity goes towards heating and cooling. And then those other uses in this diagram that make up about 40% go to other appliances like dishwashers, fans, other electronics, those kinds of things. I'm guessing you all are familiar, if you've heard talk about how electricity demand is rising and forecasted to grow significantly, driven in part by things like data centers and also from different end uses moving to electricity as a major fuel. So for example, cars, other vehicles are increasingly using electricity. And then we're seeing things change too in the commercial sector as well. So one example there is the steel industry is projected to move more and more to use of electric furnaces and things like that. So we are expecting a large growth in electricity demand coming up.
Hey, Grace, there's a question that I'm not sure that you can answer, but it's a question about a ballpark estimate on how much infrastructure on a utility pole costs, like all that infrastructure you showed, and how long they take to assemble. I can provide a link to National Lab of the Rockies, their distribution component costs, but I'm not sure what else you've got.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually do not know the answer, and I think it would probably depend a little bit on like, is your utility still using wooden poles? Are they using composite poles? What kind of like, do they have cameras mounted there? You know, those kinds of investment decisions that they're making. But it's a great question, and yeah, if you have a resource, Lisa, that would be welcome because I definitely don't know the answer. Okay, thank you for the question, and please keep them coming. Thanks for letting me know there was a question. Okay, so I'm gonna get back here to just some trends we're seeing. One major one is on the distribution side of the grid. In general, we're seeing a lot of increased spending on the distribution system. There are a number of reasons for this, but a couple of important ones are one, accommodating increasing grid edge resources or distributed energy resources. We need to accommodate those with new infrastructure that can support bi-directional power flow. We're also seeing infrastructure that's aging and a need to kind of harden or improve the strength of our distribution systems overall. This is creating a transformation in our distribution system. Our electricity used to just really flow one way from generators down to customers. Now we're seeing the grid that is moving two ways bi-directional and is increasingly dynamic and sophisticated, and we're having to modernize our grid in that way. Grid modernization not only includes upgrading physical infrastructure, but also modernizing our operational practices and improving the cybersecurity of the grid, and also just managing and monitoring the system over time. Okay, so I've got another poll here. Let's see if I can pull it up. Gonna have to do this. Okay, launching this poll for you all. I'll bring the, can you all see the poll?
We can see it.
Okay, great. So the question is, what topics are you addressing as an Energy Innovator Fellow to help meet those forecasted electric sector needs? Are there specific topics you're working on or questions that you have in mind that you're working on here? You could just put in a couple of words like data centers or electric vehicles or grid modernization. Maybe you're working on cost allocation or something like that. Great, I'm seeing some questions, some answers come in. Great, I'm going to give it just another minute or so. Great, I'm still seeing answers come in, so I'll just give it another second. Okay, let's end the poll and share results. Can you all see that? Great. Well, I cannot see the results. Lisa, any insights that you're seeing?
I can see them. Oh, I don't see the results.
Okay.
How about if you click view details?
Yeah, that took me online. Let's see. Hmm. My apologies. I cannot see your results. Does anybody want to put anything in the chat or let us know what you answered there? Grid resilience. Hmm. Well, I apologize that we can't see the results. Glad to see some folks working on resilience. That's a huge topic right now. Siting and permitting, BPPs. Yes, these are huge, huge topics here. Awesome. Well, thank you all for answering. That's great. Okay, so our next section here is going to be on regulation and getting into what regulators do and why we do it. So at its core, regulation is government oversight of an industry that has significant public impacts. Regulation works to ensure that those players in the industry are acting in a way that will serve the public's interest. In practice, serving the public interest is challenging because it requires balancing a number of different objectives. These include meeting state objectives like mandates to meet demand with certain types of energy, economic principles like allowing market competition, protecting customers like ensuring the system is operating safely, and serving private interests like giving utilities the opportunity to remain financially viable. These can sometimes be in conflict because what might keep utilities most financially viable may not be what keeps bills affordable for customers, and regulators make decisions to help optimize these different interests and find solutions that are mutually reinforcing across different objectives. Utilities provide services that have been and that are increasingly critical for us to live healthy and safe lives. So, for example, broadband and telecommunication are absolutely vital to accessing emergency services and working remotely. Electricity, of course, is vital for many reasons, but is particularly important for people who might use electrical medical devices or for keeping cool on hot days. To provide those services, though, utilities have infrastructure that physically crosses public areas and can create like public impact. So, for example, gas pipelines might run under private property, or electrical cables could obstruct your nice view. So regulation establishes the rules of the road for those services and then works to hold utilities accountable to those standards. This slide shows utility industries that are commonly regulated, but the extent to which the industry is regulated or competitive varies by state. So, for example, this graphic illustrates that every PUC regulates electric and natural gas utilities in some way, but others also have special mandates to help regulate the housing sector, transportation, or other industries as well. Across utilities, regulators set standards and expectations, including that utilities are obligated to serve customers in exchange for rates that will cover their costs to provide that service. This is a concept called the regulatory compact. And it's important to note that there are bounds around this concept in that utilities do not necessarily have to provide service to customers who don't pay their bills, and the level of rates that are allowed to be recovered from customers are closely scrutinized by regulators before they're approved. Another regulatory standard is that services should be provided in a way that is safe, that there's enough of it, that it's reliable, and that rates are just and reasonable. The photo on this slide is just a bunch of distribution and telecoms wires near my place in Hawaii. And it's just intended to show that by the nature of this industry, allowing multiple companies to compete for the delivery of electricity actually results in higher overall costs because it creates entirely redundant distribution systems. Put another way, it's inefficient to have multiple companies own competing electric distribution lines. This is called a natural monopoly. Utility in the electric sector, then regulation is a market intervention that takes the place of competition to help ensure that utilities are serving the public interest and to help set prices. There are multiple levels of regulatory authority over utilities. The different layers of jurisdiction are outlined in federal and state laws. So at the federal level, the major player is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. For the electric sector, they generally oversee anything crossing state lines. This is called interstate commerce, and includes rates and services for interstate transmission and wholesale power sales for public utilities. In this role, FERC oversees the governance of non-discriminatory open access to the transmission system for power generators and oversees the rates and terms for use of the transmission system. FERC also oversees how wholesale markets are run and how prices are set within those markets. Those markets cover what's called sales for resale, which basically means that buyers will resell its purchased electricity to another entity that ultimately sells it to the customer. Another major part of FERC's role is setting reliability standards for the bulk power system and monitoring compliance with those standards. So they work with an organization called NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, to do this. NERC helps to identify and enforce standards, studies threats to reliability, and does monitoring and education for the industry. As with FERC, the jurisdiction of state regulators is set in state law, so it will vary by state. And for those of you working at PUCs, I highly recommend, and for those of you working at utilities or any organization really, I think it's really helpful to refer back to the state statute. That's the chapter on your PUC, which establishes the PUC and its authority. It's a really helpful reference for what your PUC is expected to do and how it's expected to do it. In general, state regulators' authority typically covers identifying how much it will cost the utility to provide service to customers. So this is called the revenue requirement. And then approving rates that are just and reasonable to allow the company to recover those costs. Regulators may also have some authority over what resources the utility buys and its overall portfolio of resources. This varies by state and is usually considered separately from whether the utility can actually recover those costs. Regulators typically also oversee major utility financial transactions like a change of control or ownership or a merger and acquisition, something like that. Regulators also oversee competition and help to determine when monopolies are appropriate and make sure that utilities are not acting in anti-competitive ways. And then regulators also set technical standards related to safety and reliability. Okay, so next we're going to get into market structures. To me, this area is complex. There are a lot of different layers, but hopefully we can walk through the major markets where electricity is bought and sold with some clarity and discuss the major players in each. Okay, so first there are two major types of electricity sales, wholesale and retail. Wholesale transactions are just like those in any other type of market where the good is purchased in bulk and sold to a reseller, not to the customer. And then retail transactions are when electricity finally gets sold directly to the customer or end user. So this table illustrates at a high level the components of both types of transactions. For wholesale power, the key is that power resellers are buying the electricity. Sellers are those entities that generate the electricity, so power plant owners like utilities or independent companies, and companies that aggregate and sell energy from DERs as well. Wholesale power transactions occur in multiple types of markets. So this can include direct trading or bilateral trading, markets that operate on different timescales from real-time trading to years in the future, and also markets that only transact in ancillary services. And then wholesale power moves from the generators over transmission lines. For retail power, buyers are the end users or the end use customers. They are buying electricity from either a power reseller or directly from a power plant owner for their use. Retail transactions happen as either sales directly to the customer, so i.e. from a utility to a customer, or retail electricity can also be traded bilaterally. Retail transactions can use all sections of the grid depending on who is involved. This slide's a little small, hopefully you can come back to and refer to this later, but it's intended to illustrate the difference between what we call a vertically integrated and restructured or deregulated markets. At a high level, laws are going to establish the rules of the road for the market structure and who can own what and who can sell what. On the left, you have vertically integrated states where utilities are allowed to own generation and sell it to customers. In these states, utilities can also purchase electricity from different companies that own generation, but utilities can own their own generation. In the middle, some states are partially deregulated, meaning that the utility is allowed to own generation, but some customers could also choose to get their electricity from a different provider. And then on the right, utilities are not allowed to own generation in deregulated or restructured markets, meaning that they own and operate the infrastructure to get electricity to customers, even though the customer is purchasing it from somebody else. Within each of these markets, utilities also have different ownership types. This is important because the utility's business model influences how it is regulated. At the top, we have investor-owned utilities. These are owned by private companies, and then their rates are regulated by public utility commissions. IOUs serve the majority of load in the country, and because of their ownership model, regulators might have to interact with Wall Street analysts because these are private companies and consider shareholders because of those entities play a role in whether the utility is financially viable. Municipal utilities, are owned by the local government. In most states, they are regulated by the city council or by an elected commission, but in some states, they are regulated by the PUC. Their ownership model typically means that any earnings they get are returned back to the city residents. A public utility district is actually a government agency in itself, governed by a board of directors that are elected by the residents served by that utility. Cooperatives or co-ops are similar in that they're governed by an elected board of directors, but they are private nonprofit organizations. And then finally, there are some utilities that are owned by the state or federal government, by tribes, or by other entities. I see a question in the chat. How many states have been deregulated, restructured? Lisa, do you know this off the top of your head? I'm actually not
I
sure
can
about
say
that.
it's 2/3 of retail load in the country. And I'll put a link in the chat with the states.
I see another question coming in. Let me just read that. So how does that work? So the question is, some customers have a choice as to how their retail electricity or who their electricity provider is. In other words, an average resident can pay their utility bill to utility A or B. Does this exist somewhere? If so, how does that work for utility A or B to meter how much a customer uses if infrastructure might be shared? It's a good question. So, this works differently in different states, and maybe I'll just go back a slide here. But you can see here, so some states are partially or fully deregulated, in which the utility or the customer might have a choice of who their provider is. In those cases, there is a distribution utility that still owns the distribution infrastructure in order to get that electricity to the customer. So you might be choosing your provider, your supplier of electricity, but you're still paying a utility for the service that it's providing in terms of distributing it to the customer itself. Lisa, do you have anything to add there?
I'm not sure if I entirely understood the question in terms of metering. It's handled differently in other countries. In some places, metering is done, by the retail the alternative retail provider. So I'm not sure, here basically the distribution utility, the utility provides the distribution services and all of the billing services for the energy commodity that the retail customer at a residential level might be getting from the provider of last choice, which is the utility. A lot of residential customers get their energy that way in restructured states, or it could be from the alternative electricity supplier if they chose one.
Yeah, Arnell, please come out off mute. That's fine.
I think y'all might have touched on it, and maybe I'm maybe missing the
I'm not hearing you if you're trying to clarify your question.
hello, 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 hello. How about now? Can you hear me? I apologize about
Yes,
that.
we got you.
Yes, sorry. Thanks for staying with me. Yeah, happy to help clarify, and I apologize if this is maybe going over my head, but like if you're a residential customer and you've got the distribution system that's out there. Grace, you mentioned that that's owned by a particular utility, but as a utility customer, like as a resident, you have a choice to pay your bill to some certain provider. I guess is that you're paying the provider who generated that electricity way back at the source? Is that right? Maybe I'm misunderstanding. I apologize.
I think you're understanding correctly. Yes. So you would be paying the generator, but also
Well,
the,
not directly, certainly not
okay.
directly. If you were a very large customer, very large, not residential, you might have an agreement with a provider directly. Typically, you're going through
Mm.
a supplier that's the intermediary. And um, typically, like for residential customers, you're paying through the utility gives you one consolidated bill, but sometimes, it can be split. I mean, it just depends. But the generator is going through an intermediary, whether it's the utility or it is an alternative electricity supplier of some sort.
So I suppose where does that when when they say that consumers have a choice, like an average residential customer has a choice to, choose a certain provider, are they always getting a bill from utility A, and it's just that utility A is reimbursing somebody else upstream?
That's right.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, okay, I see. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for letting me come off mute and clarify that. Thank you.
Good question. Kelly, do you also want to ask a question?
I do, and feel free if we need to keep moving to say not right now. um, but with respect to deregulation, the example I have in my head is with the state of Montana, and historically there's a big push for deregulation that created a lot of like chaos and complications, and then they re-regulated. And now some of the implications of that is that in the generation infrastructure, there are multiple owners with different varying amounts, and it can create complications around, what to do around those. Like, for example, coal plants that may be closing. I guess my question is, what are some of the implications of these different regulation structures and yeah, and if that tracks historically.
Really good question. I'm not sure that I don't know that I have great insight into that. Lisa, do you have any thoughts?
Could you summarize the question? I got pinged by
Yes.
someone, got
Yeah, sorry.
distracted.
Are there any like implications of these different regulation structures for either users or local or tribal governments that are participating, things that they should be aware of?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question, but so restructuring is applying in terms of on the retail side, retail restructuring, that doesn't apply to municipal utilities, right? So this is just like for the investor-owned utilities that are required to divest of their generating resources as well as transmission in many states. So it's optional for local governments and tribes to purchase on the market. And like even in states that have regional transmission operators or integrated system operators that run energy markets and in some cases capacity markets. Some of the utilities are still vertically integrated. So it's a real mixed bag. But if you're specifically talking about local, that's like really voluntary on the part of the local government. If they have their own utility. And if they don't, then they're a customer like other retail customers. So they might be, they're a non-residential customer of a certain size, and they have options based on, what's available to all other non-residential customers. The exception is there's usually a separate street lighting tariff, but now we're getting into the weeds.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to provide more information offline.
Yeah, and I think if I'm understanding too, you're asking sort of like pros and cons of these different types of market structures. And I think there are pros and cons to each of them. Some utilities would say that owning generation allows them to better manage it and operate it in a way that allows them to have more control over it. Whereas, others would argue that a third party can do that equally as well. So there are some pros and cons to each of these. Okay, continuing on here. Thanks for the questions. I do really appreciate them. I wanted to just illustrate with this graphic that almost every PUC fully regulates IOUs. And the only exceptions based on these data are Delaware, which has more limited authority over IOUs, and Nebraska, which I believe is the only state in the country without any IOUs. For munis and co-ops, the percentage is much lower and the authority of the PUC is more frequently limited in some way or another. So for example, in Indiana, the commission always has authority over which utility serves what territory, but those utilities can actually choose to withdraw from regulation over their rates and financing. Outside of utilities, there are other participants in these energy markets. On the right, we're showing where each of these players typically shows up in the market. So Federal Power Marketing Administrations, or PMAs, were created to market the hydroelectric power produced from federal dams, and they can also own and operate electrical systems. I think this came up in the chat, but community choice aggregators, or CCAs, are usually an independent company or sometimes a government entity that buys electricity on behalf of governments for residents in that area. They are primarily energy resellers operating in areas where customers can choose their electricity suppliers. Generation and transmission cooperatives exist to help smaller distribution utilities gain economies of scale in the GNT space. Independent power producers are those companies that own power plants. They are the generators that sell electricity to utilities or into wholesale markets, or sometimes directly to customers, depending on the state's market structure. And then finally, we have GER aggregators. That's a grid edge resource or a distributed energy resource, which is a growing industry. These are companies that work with utilities and sometimes directly with customers who have rooftop solar or batteries or water heaters that can provide grid services. And they pool all those resources and provide them into markets or to utilities. Within each market, there are multiple types of transactions that utilities and other players can use to buy and sell electricity. On the wholesale side, utilities can buy and trade power directly with one another or with IPPs. That's called a bilateral transaction. In areas where there is a regional grid operator, they are authorized by FERC to run organized wholesale markets where sellers can offer their services and buyers can purchase. Wholesale markets typically run at different temporal levels. So real-time energy that balance immediate needs, day-ahead markets to support shorter-term needs, and longer-term capacity markets where you can get capacity services a few years in advance. On the retail side of things, utilities can sell directly to you, the customer, or customers can choose who they buy their electricity from. The wholesale side of things gets a bit complex. There are a lot of different players in the space. So zooming out for a big picture, the country's grid is actually 3 distinct grids that operate independently. These are called interconnections. Within those interconnections, there are balancing authorities that are kind of the boots on the ground that actually balance the supply and demand of smaller grid areas. RTOs and ISOs, regional transmission organizations and independent system operators, utilities, and power marketing authorities can all act as those balancing authorities depending on the region. The RTOs and ISOs have big jobs in the bulk power system. They're responsible for making sure that the transmission system is accessible to generators. They operate the regional grid, run wholesale markets, and help to oversee the reliability of the system, including planning for the future. RTOs and ISOs are functionally the same thing, but under the technical definitions at FERC, RTOs have slightly more responsibility and usually cover a bigger geographic area, but in practice, you'll typically hear folks use RTO and ISO interchangeably. The Texas RTO, I just wanted to call out here, does not actually include any transactions with other states, so they are not regulated by FERC. This slide shows maps of electric reliability organizations and of the different RTOs and ISOs. Within each interconnection, there are 6 smaller regional entities that work with NERC, the National Electric Reliability Corporation, to make sure the bulk power system is reliable. In regions where there isn't an RTO or ISO, the utilities typically use bilateral transactions to acquire and trade power. In the West, the California ISO also runs a real-time trading market that utilities can choose to participate in to help with real-time grid balancing. I wanted to call out FERC Order 2222 because this is really impactful for state authorities. This order enables grid edge resources to participate as wholesale resources. This is relevant to state regulators and distribution utilities because it allows those grid edge resources to act as wholesale resources. And the order established a lot of coordination requirements between those wholesale level folks, the distribution utilities, and state regulators. So for example, one piece of that is called a deliverability review, because even though the resources are delivering bulk power systems, they are actually connected at the distribution level, meaning that the local utilities still need to confirm that those resources are interconnected safely. And so they conduct what they call a deliverability review, which means that the utility is confirming that the resource has an interconnection agreement in place, that resources are not going to violate export caps or grid reliability needs, and to generally make sure that those resources can do what the bulk system thinks they are going to do safely. This practice is pretty new, definitely still getting off the ground, but I think it's an important model to help with coordination and thinking about how we can use local resources most effectively. Okay, that was a lot. We're going to get into some regulatory processes at the state level and what kind of day-to-day looks like at a state PUC. Well, there are a lot of different kinds of things that PUCs do. There's never a dull day there. This slide shows some of the major types of proceedings that you'll get at a PUC, meaning the different types of approvals or decisions or questions that the PUC must answer. Rulemaking is an administrative process where the commission outlines how it's going to do its job and how the utilities will meet regulatory expectations. Rate cases allow the commission to consider changes to what the utility charges its customers. Once decisions are made, tariffs are the formal rules of the road or the terms and conditions and prices that the utility uses. Investigative proceedings are often higher level where the commission is looking into a more complex or maybe emerging issue. Planning proceedings help the commission oversee where the grid is going and how the utility will meet its obligations. And then in some states, utilities might file an application to procure resources or to commit funds to new projects or programs. Each of these types of proceedings has a different process. Some types of proceedings are much more formal and need to follow very specific rules and procedures. What types of proceeding follow what process is laid out in your state law or in the commission's rules? So for example, in all states, rate cases are going to be formal because this is really the fundamental responsibility of the commission, where they have to ensure that rates are just and reasonable. For formal proceedings, the commission can only use what's on the official record to make their decision and can't consider anything outside of that. But regardless of the type of proceeding, most proceedings have some common procedural steps that are shown here. So approving requests for intervention, like who can participate, having listening sessions or workshops, asking questions and doing discovery through information requests, and then issuing a decision and order at the end of the process. So who are the participants? Again, the rules will tell you who can participate and what their rights are within that proceeding. In all states, there's a designated entity that's responsible for representing customers, residential customers, in proceedings at the PUC. These are called the consumer advocate. It might have a slightly different name in your state. But there are also a lot of different parties that influence commissioners and commission proceedings, whether it's inside or outside of a proceeding. These can be political influences, industry influences, advocacy groups, many others. I know a couple of you are with state energy offices. Sort of varies state by state, and then based on the type of proceeding, whether or not the energy office chooses to participate at the PUC, that's going to be like a strategic decision as to whether and how you all get involved at the PUC. Okay, so delving into the major types of proceedings, the first is rulemaking, the steps of which are highlighted in the image below. Rulemaking is really important because it addresses a policy or legal change that affects how the commission or the utility does its business. Rulemaking typically includes drafting a proposed new rule or change to the rules, inviting the public and stakeholders to comment on that draft, considering and building on those comments, and then finalizing or adopting the rules. In some states, rules actually have to go through additional review by state government or even judicial review before they become final. General rate cases, or GRCs, are foundational proceedings that determine what the utility can charge to customers. They are formal, which is called a contested or litigated case, meaning that there are rights at stake in the proceeding. In a rate case, the commission is determining how much the utility needs to charge to recover their costs, which includes looking at what the utility spends in a year and determining if those costs are prudent. This is called a test year, and it can either look backwards based on historical costs or out into the future. Both approaches have benefits and drawbacks. In a GRC, an important piece of it is also determining the utility's authorized rate of return, or what the utility can earn in profit based on its capital structure. This is often the most contentious and hotly debated part of the proceeding because it really has big impact on the utility's business and overall costs. A GRC will usually include a hearing or an evidentiary hearing, which is basically like a day in court. So again, these are quite formal, and in many cases, a rate case will have like a statutory deadline. So for example, in this image, Nevada's rate cases have to occur within 210 days. Investigations are often much more flexible than rate cases, and they can use less formal approaches to information gathering. So like stakeholder collaboratives or even seeking public input. These were always my favorite to work on at the commission because they're usually addressing some emerging issue or really interesting, more complex question like rate design or looking at how to improve overall affordability. The outcome of these proceedings is usually some sort of guidance for how the utility should approach things going forward. So they'll usually apply to a whole group of utilities rather than just one utility. Another common type of proceeding is an integrated resource planning proceeding, or an IRP. These are where the utility is looking out into the future to see how much electricity they will need to provide and the best way to provide that. And best can mean different things to different people. It often requires balancing different objectives like making rates affordable, ensuring adequate reliability, and reducing risk overall. Usually this will result in an accepted plan. The commission will say, we accept your integrated resource plan, maybe not approve it formally, because these typically are not intended to be very restrictive. They're supposed to be kind of flexible and as a guide and not meant to be prescriptive going forward. Another important planning process is called distribution system planning or integrated distribution system planning. This process takes a similar approach to IRP, but is looking specifically at the distribution system rather than the bulk power system. Integrated distribution system planning looks at what the distribution system needs to meet your state's objectives, serve customers reliably, and then maybe meet other objectives like integrating more distributed or grid edge resources and developing efficiencies with the bulk power system. This image shows elements of a decision-making framework that help to enable integrated distribution system plans. This is really foundational just to think through, like, how can our distribution system be planned holistically and effectively to meet our needs over time? There are a lot of other types of plans that utilities create as well. So utilities and other entities with a stake in the transmission system will plan for what the future transmission system needs to look like. Those are really looking at some gnarly questions like how much transmission do we need, where will it go, and who will pay for what. If the state has other goals around other topics, they might have a specific plan for those as well. So for example, these are showing some images from Nevada's integrated resource planning process, which actually includes specific planning for grid edge resources. These are some specific images from their hosting capacity analysis and locational net benefits analysis of how those DERs could serve broader goals as well. In general, coordinating all the different types of plans that your state is doing helps to create efficiencies and make sure that they're aligned in their objectives. One area that we're seeing a lot of growth is utilities are trying to better consider the distribution system in integrated resource planning. This is really important to make sure that our distribution system is helping to serve those bulk power system needs. All right, so I know we're coming up on the end here. I just want to leave you with a couple of resources, and as Lisa put in the chat, we are very open to follow-ups and to additional questions, but we do have a couple minutes if folks have questions right at this moment. Okay, I am not hearing any questions from you all. Really appreciated your engagement today. I thought you asked some great questions, and we're always here to be resources for you and your organization. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Yeah, please refer back to these slides. They are online, and let us know if you have any additional questions. Thank you, everyone.